Right, so we're doing the poem Nobody Loses All the Time by Cummings. And Cummings, he was born in 1894, died in 1962. And when you look at those dates, you see there that he was, he lived through the entire Second World War. I'm talking now as an adult. And what's very interesting about Cummings is that he started writing poetry at the age of 10. Just some interesting background about this person, Cummings. He obtained a master's degree from Harvard. He studied Latin and Greek. So he was a very well-educated person. We actually call a person who's very well-educated, we call that person an erudite. So he was a true erudite. During his lifetime, he wrote 2,900 poems. He wrote essays, novels, autobiographies besides the poems that is. And Cummings was the number 2 poet in the US. And the reason why I'm saying that is because the first one, Robert Frost, was the most widely read poet. Everyone knew the works of Robert Frost. And then Cummings, he was number 2 on the list. And he went to, in the Second World War, he worked as an intern, and he was very briefly in the Second World War when he was arrested, interned, and he was in a French prison camp, almost like a little concentration camp. Okay, and that affected him greatly. And then the last thing I want to say about Cummings, and I'm sure that some of you have heard of Cummings, is that he's best known for his very quirky and unusual approach to not just to poem writing, but to punctuation. He always uses lowercase, and even when he writes his name, he always writes E, lowercase, E, lowercase. And of course, Cummings, the E stands for Edward Estlin Cummings. So we're going to look at this poem entitled Nobody Loses All the Time. And before we really get into the poem, I just want you to notice that the poem has no real punctuation. We don't find much sense of organization. The poem is actually quite disorganized. There are very awkward line breaks, and we will look at that as we go along. So I'm going to start off just by reading the poem. Nobody Loses All the Time by Cummings. I had an uncle named Sol who was a born failure, and nearly everybody said he should have gone into vaudeville. Perhaps because my Uncle Sol could sing McCanny Was a Diver on Christmas Eve like hell itself, which may or may not account for the fact that my Uncle Sol indulged in that possibly most inexcusable of all, to use a highfalutin phrase, luxuries, that is, or to wit, farming. And be it needlessly added, my Uncle Sol's farm failed because the chickens ate the vegetables. So my Uncle Sol had a chicken farm till the skunks ate the chickens, when my Uncle Sol had a skunk farm, but the skunks caught cold and died, and so my Uncle Sol imitated the skunks in a subtle manner, or by drowning himself in a water tank. But somebody who'd given my Uncle Sol a Victor Victrola and records while he lived presented him upon the auspicious occasion of his decease a scrumptious, not to mention splendiferous funeral, with tall boys in black gloves and flowers and everything. And I remember we all cried like the Missouri when my Uncle Sol's coffin lurched because somebody pressed a button and down went my Uncle Sol and started a worm farm. Now, it's not really that difficult to understand. The language usage is pretty straightforward, but just some things that we do need to take note of. And I'd like to start by looking at the title of this poem, Nobody Loses All the Time. And that title indicates that loss is part of life. Loss is part of life. Nobody loses all the time. And if we had to place an emphasis, I would say we could emphasize nobody. We could also emphasize the word all, meaning nobody loses all the time. You can lose some of the time, but you won't lose all the time. So that's the first point, that some loss happens to everyone. And then the second part is that when he says nobody loses all the time, I guess we could say, he's making it sound that Uncle Sol is unusual because Uncle Sol lost all the time. So there's the contradiction also surrounding the use of the word nobody, meaning it's a contradiction with the protagonist, with Uncle Sol. Nobody loses all the time, but Sol loses all the time. Do you see what I'm trying to get at? Right. Then when we go to our I suppose you could say it's the first line, although I didn't indicate it as the first line, but I suppose it is the first line, nobody loses all the time, which would then give you a total of 38 lines. But the way I have numbered my poem, I started my line, one was I had an uncle, which is incorrect, so please don't do that as well. So when he says nobody loses all the time, that could show that our speaker believes in perseverance, meaning that you need to constantly put in effort, and eventually you will be successful, you will be rewarded. And I feel that is taking us back to Cummings himself, because as a student he experienced many failures, but eventually Cummings did experience personal success, and that is, of course, by the time that he graduates from university. So he then says, I had an uncle named Sol. And it's interesting that he uses the lowercase I. I don't know if you're going to agree with me, but I think the I shows that he maybe does not have such a strong sense of self-esteem. He feels a little bit insignificant. So he says, I had an uncle named Sol who was born a failure. And let's just stop by the name of this uncle, Sol. Sol is actually Latin for the sun. And when we think of the sun, which is very powerful, we think of the sun as life giver. Do you remember in grade 11 when we did when we were doing war poetry, and we spoke about the sun as life giver? When we looked at the poem, Put Him in the Sun, because the soldier was dead. Does that perhaps sound familiar? It's not important. Okay, so Sol, who was a born failure, and there we've got that contradiction, right? Born, and usually people are born and then they go on to achieve great things. And here he's saying he was born, but it didn't go up, it was born straight down into failure. So we've got that bit of a contradiction there. Nearly everybody said he should have gone into vaudeville. So vaudeville is an old-fashioned show that they used to put on. Think of a variety show, a talent show, where people were allowed to showcase their different talents. You know, it was just a diverse array of talents. And when my line 3 says nearly everyone said, that tells us that Saul was often discussed by people. One, discussing his failures, his abject failures, and secondly, his talent was talked about. So we get the idea that there was something that Saul was probably good at, okay, if he was on stage. Nearly everybody said he should have gone into vaudeville, perhaps because my Uncle Saul could sing. And then in line 5, we have that, you will see all the capital letters, McCann, he was a diver on Christmas Eve like hell itself. And that funny line is the name of the song. You know, I actually Googled that song and I tried to listen to it. It was just some insane noise, but that was the song that he that he could sing, which may or may not account for the fact that my Uncle Saul indulged, and the word indulge it's the opposite of a necessity. It's that very special way of treating yourself, is to do something that's pleasurable just for the pure enjoyment of it. I mean, just think about, what do you like to indulge yourself in? I like to indulge with chocolate, a good bottle of red wine. I'm allowed to say that. Just something that you really enjoy. I can even indulge myself by buying myself a pair of really expensive shoes. So he says here, the fact that my Uncle Saul indulged in that possibly most inexcusable of all. And then I want you to jump over all the other words because they are extraneous, right to the end of all. And then we go to line 10, farming. So that is what Saul indulged in. He indulged in farming. And then all the other words in between are words that help to convey the tone. It sounds very much like the narrator, who in this case is actually the nephew, because he says my uncle, it's his nephew, but the tone is now very casual. You can hear the person is having a conversation, and then the person says, Saul indulged in that possibly most inexcusable of all, and then I want you to put that in, I want you to use brackets, to use a highfalutin phrase. You put that in brackets. And highfalutin is it's actually a negative word. It means, you know, to be quite pretentious about something. And when the person says to use a highfalutin phrase, the person says, oh, please forgive me. The person's almost apologizing, saying, forgive me for using this fancy phrase. Okay. In that possibly most inexcusable of all, to use a highfalutin phrase, luxuries. That is, or, and then the person uses another little phrase that's unnecessary, to wit. And the phrase to wit means it's a way of saying something. Okay. It could also be interpreted when the person says to wit, namely farming. Talking a lot, this person, this nephew, okay, all he's saying is, and I want you to get this, is that farming was a luxury. And why is it a luxury? Because what Saul should have done was get a real job, and he didn't. Farming is a luxury. Think about it. You work for yourself, you have your own hours, you determine what you're going to do for the day. Farming, and be it needlessly added. Then we have those last two lines, be it needlessly added. He's saying it's a foregone conclusion that Uncle Sol would fail. You don't have to spell it out because Sol is not talented in this aspect. He can sing, but he's not a farmer. So it's a foregone conclusion. Okay, we go on to the next paragraph, stanza. Please note that there are no commas and full stops. So this is actually one long, drawn out conversation that is taking place. And we are going to come back and look at the structure and the length of the lines. We are going to come back and look at that. And then he says, my Uncle Sol's farm failed because the chickens ate the vegetables. So straight away we see that Sol's first farm was growing vegetables. And the disorganization of Sol comes into play here because how did the chickens get access to the vegetables? It doesn't sound as if he had fenced it off. It doesn't sound as if the chickens were kept separately. Maybe they were I don't even think they were his chickens. So he's not a very organized person. So Uncle Sol's farm failed because the chickens ate the vegetables. So my Uncle Sol had a chicken farm. So now the vegetables. Okay. So now the vegetables are all destroyed or eaten or whatever, they have died. And so now he decides his second option, he's going to farm with chickens, and I mean that's something that we can probably really relate to. So he again was not prepared. He didn't do his homework. He didn't do his research. He didn't prepare adequately for having the chickens. And then it says, so my Uncle Sol had a chicken farm till the skunks ate the chickens. Now, again, he had not learnt any lesson from the time when he had the vegetables about adequate preparation and looking after, and so on and so on. Now, the skunks ate the chickens. In Swaziland, there's a little animal, and I know for a fact it's related to the skunk. And if you go to the Makayas and you have family and you spend time there, you will know exactly what I'm talking about. And for those who don't know, I promise you I'm not making this up. And this skunk in Swaziland, or this cousin of the skunk, what he does is he goes to where the chickens are. And he's also got that tail, the tail like the skunk. And he lifts his tail and he pushes his, I think it's the lining of his anus. He pushes it out, and it looks to the chickens like mealies. And when the chicken comes to peck, it grabs and holds the chicken. Then it turns around and it's got the prey. And I was thinking of that, and I don't know what the word is. I forget what the Siswati word is. And I was thinking of that straight away when I read, my Uncle Sol had a chicken farm till the skunks ate the chickens. And so I just have this image of the skunks coming in, sneaking in, and slowly decimating his entire group of chickens till the skunks ate the chickens. So now we've got the failure of the vegetables, the failure of the chickens. When my Uncle Sol had a skunk farm. Okay, I was kind of thrown when I read a skunk farm, and I thought a skunk farm, those nasty little animals with a with that tail, and they are mainly black, right? With that white running down. And what is a skunk most known for? A skunk is mostly known for releasing that really bad scent. Not even a scent, it's an odor when it's in a trapped, when it feels trapped or cornered, as a way of defending itself against its enemies. So anyway, did you know that a century ago skunks were farmed, and they were farmed for their fur? So it does make sense in a way, but you don't call it you don't really call it fur, you call it the pelt. You call the fur a pelt. So people did, but then the demand ceased, and so people no longer farmed with skunks. So then we had the vegetables, the chickens, the skunks. Had a skunk farm, but the skunks caught cold and died. We could argue that the skunks falling ill was maybe fate. It was beyond the control of Uncle Sol. But the bottom line is his third attempt at farming failed. The skunks caught cold and died, and so my Uncle Sol imitated the skunks in a subtle manner. Imitate means to copy. How did he copy them? And that's answered in the very next line, by drowning himself in a water tank. So the skunks died and Uncle Sol died. We have the imitation there. And now I think it's at this point where we see that Uncle Sol, two things that I want you to note about Uncle Sol. One, he is a tragic protagonist. Now, why am I saying tragic protagonist? Because you know from Shakespearean drama that when our protagonist is a tragic figure, it means he dies. Okay, oftentimes there is death around him as well, but our protagonist dies. Uncle Sol is our tragic protagonist. And secondly, I want you to note that Uncle Sol is a comic hero. Why do I say comic? Because if you think about it, it's kind of laughable. It's laughable. You know, this man was just a flop, no matter what he was trying, you know. But I suppose he could sing, and he would sing at times, and people would laugh or people would be entertained. But he was a tragic protagonist and a comic hero. My Uncle Sol imitated the skunks in a subtle manner. Subtle means very quiet, as teenagers say, very low key, very discreetly. So I'd like to think that Sol died quietly, or by drowning himself in the water tank. If you think about it, the drowning was avoidable. Water tanks on a farm or in rural areas, they tend to be very high up. You've got to climb up to get it. So it was something that was a deliberate action. It was probably planned. By drowning himself in a water tank. And I want us at this point to take note of the speaker's attitude towards death. He doesn't seem very freaked out by the idea that the uncle died. In fact, his attitude towards death is, one, it's very accepting, and two, it's almost upbeat. It's almost optimistic, but not quite. And I just want to stop there for a minute. And you know how I'm always telling you that the narrator isn't the writer. But sometimes some of the writer's persona or feelings, they come through the narrator. So the narrator in this case is the nephew. The writer is E.E. Cummings. And so E.E. Cummings' feelings, his views are coming through um, the nephew. And now, why am I mentioning that? Because remember, E. Cummings was in the Second World War. He saw a lot of death. He experienced deaths around him firsthand, and he wasn't, I won't say he wasn't freaked out, but I think he was used to the idea of death. Okay, so now we go back to our poem. Or by drowning himself in the water tank. But somebody who had given my Uncle Sol, somebody, the person is not mentioned by name, which tells us one, either the nephew didn't know him, or he didn't know him very well, or it was someone who was just probably a friend of Uncle Sol's. But somebody who'd given my Uncle Sol a Victrola and records while he was alive. So here we've got the idea of Uncle Sol receiving a gift. And it's not just a gift, it's a large gift. The gift is what? It's a record player. And I'm sure you've seen pictures of this record player. It's your usual record player with the arm. You put the record down and then you put the arm with the needle and then it goes round. Okay, so what makes this record player very standoutish is that it has a horn. We call it a horn. It's that it's attached to the record player, and it's got that big, for the sound. I don't know if you are able to have a look at that. Did you see that? I tried to show you what the Victrola looks like. So that was the gift that was given to Uncle Sol. And obviously the person liked him so much because the person didn't just give him that, which was quite an expensive gift, but the person gave him the records to play as well. And I get the idea that this is someone who enjoyed Uncle Sol's singing. Okay. Who had given my Uncle Sol a Victrola and records while he lived. I also want you to take note of the fact that the person who gave this to Sol probably believed in him and probably believed that Sol could make it as a singer. He could succeed in music despite his other failures. So this is one long idea, but what's happening here in this stanza is that one, Sol drowned. He killed himself. Then someone, when he was alive, had given him the record player and the records. And that same person, after the death of Uncle Sol, paid for a very elaborate funeral. That's the point that's being made. Now let's go back to our poem. But somebody who had given my Uncle Sol a Victrola and records while he lived presented to him upon the auspicious occasion. The word auspicious, I like using it myself, just means it's a very important occasion. And it's so funny the use of it here, because usually you would talk, an auspicious occasion is when a child is born. But here auspicious occasion is referring to the death of Uncle Sol, upon the auspicious occasion of his decease. And so we've got the bit of a contradiction here, the decease, the death, right, instead of the birth. A scrumptious, not to mention splendiferous funeral. So we've got three big words being used here. Auspicious occasion, scrumptious funeral, splendiferous funeral. So obviously the narrator is trying to make a real impression on his audience, trying to just emphasize how wow this funeral was. And splendiferous specifically, and even, but let's just go back to scrumptious. Scrumptious meaning something, we usually would use scrumptious for food. And when we say something is scrumptious, we mean it's very enjoyable. So the idea here is that the people who were at the funeral, they really enjoyed the funeral. Not to mention splendiferous funeral. And so I'm again focusing on the use of the word splendiferous funeral, which is in direct contradiction with poor Uncle Sol's life. The life was not splendiferous. There was nothing splendid. There was nothing awesome about his life. And then we have details of what made this funeral so splendid, so splendiferous, with tall boys in black gloves. And so the black gloves just create that sense of dignity and, more importantly, formality, and flowers and everything. So there was a lot of extras that were at this funeral that was not at your average, ordinary, everyday funeral. Tall boys in black gloves and flowers and everything. And I remember we all cried like the Missouri. So again, this is evidence that this is an American-based poem. Missouri is, of course, a river. It's actually the second largest river in the States. It's known, it flows very fast, and so the comparison that's being made is that in the same way that the river flows fast, that's how much they were crying. They were really crying. And I think it also says a lot about the person that Uncle Sol was. He may have been a flop, but he was likable, and people were really sad at his passing. I remember we all cried like the Missouri when my Uncle Sol's coffin lurched because the coffin lurched. So if you've been to a burial, you know that they have the hole in the ground, and they have a metal frame around it, and then they've got those two bands, and then they put the coffin on the two bands, one towards the foot end, one towards the chest area. And then when they press the button, that thing, the bands, they start going down and the coffin starts going